mean I'll see it.
I never really believed those stories you see on the internet, the ones where people talk about their creepy neighbors or the weird noises coming from the attic. You always think those things happen to someone else, someone who lives in a cabin in the woods or some isolated farmhouse. But this happened in a regular, cramped apartment building right in the middle of the city. The walls were thin, the kind of thin where you can hear your neighbor's microwave beep or the muffled sound of their television at night. It was annoying, but it felt safe in a way. You always knew someone was there. The guy living next to me was older, maybe in his late 50s. He was the kind of person who seemed to blend into the background, a quiet, unremarkable man who always wore the same beige windbreaker and carried his groceries in reusable bags. He told me his name once, but it didn't stick. He mostly kept to himself until the renovation started. He knocked on my door one afternoon, offering a polite, almost nervous smile. He told me he was planning on doing some minor work in his bedroom, mostly just upgrading the shelving and fixing some old drywall. He warned me that there might be some noise for a while. I didn't think much of it. In an old building like that, everyone is always fixing something. I told him it was fine and went back to my life. That was when the tapping started. It wasn't the loud, heavy construction noise you'd expect. It was a rhythmic, obsessive sound, a low, persistent drilling and a soft, metallic scraping that began every evening just as the sun went down. It would go on for hours, sometimes until the early hours of the morning. It felt like he was working on a single spot over and over again with the precision of a surgeon. A few weeks into this, the air in my apartment started to change. There was this faint, sickly smell that began to waft through the vents. It wasn't like garbage or sewage. It was thicker, sweeter, and more cloying. It smelled like copper and rot, the kind of scent that sticks to the back of your throat and makes you want to swallow constantly just to clear it. I figured the building had a dead rat in the walls or some old pipes were finally giving up. One evening, I was in my walk-in closet, trying to organize some winter coats that had fallen off their hangers. The closet was small and cramped, sharing a common wall with his bedroom. As I pushed a heavy wool coat aside, I saw it. There was a tiny, perfectly circular hole in the drywall, right at eye level. It was so small it was almost invisible, hidden perfectly in the shadow of the door frame. I thought maybe he had accidentally drilled too far through the wall. I leaned in, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I put my eye to the hole, expecting to see his bedroom, or maybe just darkness. Instead, I saw an eye. It wasn't just a glimpse of a person walking by. It was a wide, unblinking eye, pressed so hard against the other side of the hole that I could see the tiny red capillaries in the white of the socket. It was staring directly into mine. There was no movement, no sound, just that wet, glassy stare. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest, and for a long, agonizing minute, we just stood there, separated by less than an inch of plaster and a lifetime of violated privacy. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling as if thousands of tiny insects were nesting under my pores. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just walked out of the closet, closed the door, and stood in the middle of my living room, shaking. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How long had he been there? How many holes were there? I started checking. I moved the dresser in my bedroom. There was another hole, tucked behind the mirror. I went into the bathroom and looked behind the medicine cabinet. There was a third one, angled specifically toward the shower. My entire home, the place where I felt most vulnerable and secure, had been turned into a literal gallery for a predator. I called the police from my car. I couldn't stay in that apartment for another second. When they arrived, they knocked on his door, but there was no answer. They had to break it down. I stood in the hallway, watching as they disappeared into his unit, and that's when the screaming started, not from a person, but the sound of the officers reacting to what they found. The smell that hit the hallway when that door opened was enough to make one of the younger cops retch right there on the carpet. It wasn't just a messy apartment. It was a slaughterhouse. The renovations he'd been doing weren't just about drilling the holes. He had been carefully and systematically removing the insulation and the interior studs from the shared wall, creating a narrow, hollowed-out dead space that ran the entire length of my apartment. He hadn't been living in his bedroom, he had been living inside the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. To dampen the sound of his movements so I wouldn't hear him sliding through the wall like a parasite, he had lined the cavity with whatever he could find. The police found layers of old clothes, damp cardboard, and other things. The renovation materials included the remains of a woman who had gone missing from the building 3 years prior. He had processed her, turning her into a sort of organic soundproofing, stuffing her into the gaps of the wall where the insulation used to be. The drilling I'd heard wasn't just for the peepholes. He had been bolting her bones directly to the timber to create a framework for his hidden crawl space. In his closet, they found a small, wooden chair positioned directly in front of the main hole that looked into mine. There was a small table next to it with a digital camera and dozens of memory cards. When they went through the footage, they found hundreds of hours of me. Me sleeping. Me getting dressed. Me eating dinner. But there were also clips where he wasn't behind the wall. There were videos of him standing in my kitchen while I was at work, holding one of my knives, just watching the door. There was a video of him sitting on the edge of my bed while I was asleep, his face just inches from mine, whispering things that the microphone couldn't quite pick up. He had a key. He had always had a key. He was never caught. When the police moved into the apartment, they found a secondary exit he'd cut into the floorboards leading down into the crawl space of the building's foundation. He had slipped away through the darkness of the basement before they even stepped through his front door. I moved out that night. I left everything, my clothes, my furniture, my books. I couldn't bear the thought of touching anything that his eyes might have lingered on, or anything that had been sitting in the path of that rotting smell. I live in a new place now, a modern building with thick, concrete walls and heavy steel doors. But sometimes, when it gets quiet at night, I find myself standing in the middle of my room, holding my breath. I'll hear a faint, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep in the structure of the building. Or I'll catch a scent in the air, a faint metallic tang that reminds me of copper and old, wet wood. And every time I go to my closet to hang up a coat, I find myself checking the drywall. I run my fingers over every inch of the plaster, looking for a tiny, perfectly round circle. Because the hardest part isn't knowing that he watched me. The hardest part is knowing that he's still out there, somewhere, and he's probably already started his next renovation. If you ever hear your neighbor drilling at night, don't just ignore it. Don't assume it's just a shelf or a picture frame. Because you never really know what's on the other side of the wall, or who might be looking back when you finally find the hole.
Next story.
You know that feeling when you're sitting in a room alone, and the silence is so heavy it actually starts to feel loud? That was my life for 6 months in that duplex. It was one of those old, drafty places where the wood moans every time the wind picks up, and you can hear your neighbor's muffled television through the walls. I lived on the left side. The right side was occupied by a guy named Silas. He was the building's handyman, a title the landlord used to avoid paying for real contractors. Silas was the kind of person who always seemed to be lurking in your peripheral vision, standing by his truck, fiddling with a rusted wrench, or just staring at the roofline with this blank, glassy expression. Almost as soon as I moved in, the noises started. It wasn't the usual settling of an old house. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping that happened right above my head, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. It sounded like something large was being dragged across the ceiling, a slow, wet friction that made my skin crawl. When I brought it up to the landlord, he didn't even look at me. He just waved a hand and said the attic was full of squirrels and that the insulation was old, so it amplified every little movement. He told me Silas had already checked it out and set some traps. But squirrels don't weigh 180 pounds. Squirrels don't make the drywall groan under the pressure of a footstep. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I convinced myself that living in a cheap rental meant dealing with the eccentricities of gravity and vermin. But then my mail started going missing. It began with small things: coupons, flyers, a magazine subscription. Then a birthday card from my mother arrived with the envelope already slit open, the edges jagged as if someone had used a dull butter knife. I asked Silas if he'd seen anyone messing with the boxes. He just stood there on the porch, his eyes fixed on my throat, and told me that kids in the neighborhood were probably looking for cash. He had this way of talking where his lips barely moved, making every word sound like a secret he didn't want to tell. The turning point happened in the bathroom. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my own tired reflection in the mirror, when I heard it. A soft, metallic clink from the ventilation fan directly above the toilet. I looked up, expecting to see a loose screw or a piece of debris. Instead, I saw a bead of liquid clinging to the edge of the plastic grate. It was dark, almost black in the dim light of the bathroom, and it looked thick. It hung there for a heartbeat before losing its grip. It landed on the white porcelain of the sink with a wet, heavy sound. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs. I touched the tip of my finger to the drop. It wasn't oil. It was sticky, cooling, and had that unmistakable, metallic stench of old copper. It was blood, and it was fresh enough to still be tacky. The panic didn't hit me all at once. It was a slow, numbing cold that started in my feet and worked its way up. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and a heavy iron skillet, the only thing I had that felt like a weapon. The access hatch to the attic was located in the back of my bedroom closet. I hadn't looked at it since the day I moved in. I pushed my clothes aside, my breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The wooden panel was slightly askew. A thin layer of gray dust had been disturbed, leaving clear finger marks along the edges. I dragged a chair into the closet, climbed up, and pushed the hatch open. The air that rushed down was hot, stagnant, and smelled of rotting hair and unwashed skin. I pulled myself up into the crawl space, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The attic was a long, narrow tunnel of yellow fiberglass insulation and jagged wooden rafters. The partition wall that was supposed to separate my unit from Silas's wasn't there anymore. A massive, jagged hole had been sawn through the plywood, leaving raw, splintered edges that looked like teeth. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, the fiberglass biting into my skin like thousands of tiny needles. As I crossed the line into the space above my own living room, the beam of my light hit something that made my stomach do a slow, sickening flip. It was a nest. That's the only way I can describe it. Silas hadn't just been checking the traps. He had built a living space directly over my head. There was a tattered sleeping bag laid out over a sheet of plywood to distribute his weight across the joists. An extension cord snaked through the hole from his side, powering a small, dim clip lamp that was currently turned off. And then I saw the mail. Hundreds of pages were pinned to the rafters with thumbtacks. Bank statements, private letters, even photographs he'd taken of me from the yard, all of them organized in a frantic, obsessive grid. But the worst part was the floor. Above my bathroom vent, he placed a small, plastic tray. In it lay the carcass of a gutter rat, its belly sliced open with surgical precision. The blood I'd seen earlier had leaked from the tray, through the cracks in the floorboards, and down into my vent. It wasn't an accident. It was a leak from his workshop. I followed the trail of my own stolen life with the flashlight, my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching it. Near the head of the sleeping bag, there were holes. Tiny, perfectly circular holes drilled straight through the ceiling. I realized with a jolt of pure, visceral horror that they were positioned perfectly. One was directly above my bed. One was above the shower. One was above the sofa where I sat every single night. The thumping I'd heard wasn't him moving around. It was him shifting his weight as he lay there, for hours, inches away from me, watching me through the dark. A floorboard creaked behind me. Not on my side. On his. I froze. My flashlight beam wavered, then landed on the hole in the partition. A pair of eyes caught the light. They were wide, unblinking, and reflecting the yellow glow like a predator in the brush. Silas was crouched in the opening, his long, grease-stained fingers gripping the edges of the wood. He was stripped to the waist, his skin pale and slick with sweat despite the heat. In his right hand, he held a long, rusted drywall saw. He didn't scream. He didn't rush me. He just started to grin, a slow, wet stretching of his face that showed off teeth yellowed by neglect. He whispered something, but the sound was drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough wood, the iron skillet clattering uselessly against the rafters. I practically fell through the closet hatch, landing hard on the bedroom floor. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't stop to grab my shoes. I bolted out the front door and into the street, screaming for help until my throat felt like it was lined with glass. The police found him 10 minutes later. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting on my sofa, calmly reading one of my books, the drywall saw resting on his lap. When they went into the attic, they found more than just the mail and the rat. They found a collection of trophies in a small cooler, items from other tenants who had lived in that duplex over the years. Fingernails, locks of hair, a single gold wedding band that had been reported stolen 3 years prior. I moved across the state the next day, but the damage was already done. Every time I hear a house settle or a branch scrapes against a window, I freeze. I can't look at ceiling vents anymore without seeing that dark, sticky drip. And sometimes, when it's very quiet and I'm lying in bed, I find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if the shadow I see in the corner is just a shadow, or if someone is up there, shifting their weight, waiting for me to fall asleep.
Next story.
I never really thought much about the man living in the house next to mine. He was just one of those background characters you see in a quiet neighborhood, someone who spent a lot of time tending to a garden that never seemed to bloom. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a posture that suggested he was always trying to take up as little space as possible. When I first moved in, he brought over a tin of lemon bars. They were slightly overbaked, but it was a kind gesture, or at least I told myself that at the time. I thanked him, we exchanged some small talk about the garbage pickup schedule, and I figured that would be the extent of our relationship. But then the gifts started appearing on my porch every few days. It began with small things, a single sunflower in a glass jar, a bag of expensive coffee beans, a hand-carved wooden whistle. At first, it felt neighborly, if a bit eccentric. I'd see him from my window and wave, and he would just stand there, perfectly still, watching me until I pulled the curtains shut. That was the first sign that the rhythm of his kindness was off. It wasn't the gifts themselves, but the expectation of a reaction that I couldn't provide. He didn't want a thank you. He wanted something else, something deeper that I wasn't prepared to give to a stranger. The frequency increased until there was something new on my doormat every single morning. It became a chore just to open my front door. I started feeling this heavy, suffocating pressure every time I had to leave the house. I tried to be polite. I told him, through a cracked door, that he didn't need to keep bringing things. I told him I was busy, that I appreciated the thought, but it was too much. He didn't get angry. He didn't even argue. He just stared at my throat with these pale, watery eyes and nodded very slowly, his mouth twitching into a smile that didn't reach his face. After that conversation, I stopped bringing the gifts inside. I left them on the porch to rot or be taken by the wind. I thought that would send a clear message. I thought he would take the hint and find someone else to obsess over. Instead, the nature of the offerings changed. The kindness curdled into something much darker. I walked out one morning and nearly stepped on a dead sparrow. It wasn't just a bird that had hit a window. It had been meticulously prepared. Its chest had been opened with a surgical precision, the tiny ribs splayed out like a fan to reveal the heart. There was no blood on the porch, which meant someone had done this somewhere else, cleaned it, and placed it there like a macabre piece of jewelry. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. I swept it into the bushes with a broom, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt watched. I looked toward his house, but the windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the gray morning sky. A few days later, the escalation reached a point that stripped away any remaining sense of safety. I was changing the sheets on my bed when I noticed something tucked into the corner of the window frame, pressed against the glass from the outside. It was a photograph. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling. It was a candid shot of me. I was asleep in my own bed, my face soft and vulnerable, the covers pulled up to my chin. The angle was terrifying. It had been taken from directly outside my bedroom window, which is on the ground floor. The most disturbing part wasn't just the invasion of privacy, it was the fact that I have a top-of-the-line security system. I have motion-activated floodlights and cameras covering every square inch of my property. I spent hours that night scrolling through the digital archives, looking for any sign of him. The footage showed nothing. The porch was empty. The yard was still. There were no lights flickering on, no shadows moving past the sensors. It was as if he were a ghost, or as if he knew exactly where the blind spots were. The psychological toll was becoming physical. I stopped sleeping. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the siding sounded like a footstep. I felt like a prisoner in a house I was still paying for. I called the police, but they told me that without clear footage of him on my property or a direct threat, there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. They suggested I get better locks. I wanted to scream. I already had the best locks money could buy. I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. I needed to know how he was doing it. I needed to see him. I made a pot of coffee, sat in the dark hallway near my front door, and pressed my eye to the peephole. I stayed there for hours, my legs cramping, my vision blurring into static. The neighborhood was silent. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Around 3 a.m, I heard a sound. It wasn't a footstep. It was a wet, sliding noise, like something heavy being dragged through the mud. It was coming from directly beneath me. I watched the porch through the tiny lens of the peephole. I expected to see him walking up the path from his house. I expected to see a shadow approaching from the street. But the yard remained empty. Then I saw a hand. A pale, dirt-stained hand gripped the edge of the wooden porch steps. Then another. Slowly, agonizingly, a head emerged from the darkness under the stairs. He wasn't coming from his house. He was coming from under mine. He crawled out from the latticework at the base of the porch like a human insect. He was coated in a layer of damp, black earth. His clothes were ragged, caked with filth and smelling of sour sweat and old decay. He didn't stand up. He stayed on all fours, sniffing the air, his head tilting at unnatural angles. He reached into a small bag he was carrying and pulled out a handful of wet, raw meat. It looked like a heart from something small, and placed it gently on my welcome mat. I watched, paralyzed, as he leaned forward and pressed his face against the bottom of my door. He began to whisper. It wasn't a language I recognized, just a low, rhythmic crooning, a lullaby for someone he thought he owned. He pressed his ear to the wood, listening for my breathing, listening for my life. After a few minutes, he turned around and slid back into the hole he had dug beneath the steps. He disappeared into the earth as if he were part of it. I didn't call the police right away. I couldn't move. I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, realizing that for weeks, every time I had walked out to get the mail, every time I had locked the deadbolt and felt safe, he He had been inches beneath my feet. He had dug a crawl space into the foundation, a little nest in the dirt where he could hear me walk, hear me talk on the phone, hear me sleep. He hadn't been triggering the cameras because he never went into the yard. He was already inside the perimeter. He was living in the marrow of my home. When the police finally came and pulled him out of that hole, they found more than just a stalker. They found a hollowed-out space lined with my discarded mail, locks of my hair he must have scavenged from the trash, and dozens of photographs pinned to the underside of my floorboards. He had been living in the dark, breathing the same air as me, separated only by a few inches of wood and carpet. They took him away, but the damage was done. They filled in the hole with concrete, but I can still feel the hollow space. Every time I walk across the living room, I imagine him down there, looking up, waiting for the sound of my footsteps. I moved out a month later, but I don't think I'll ever really feel alone again. Sometimes, when it's very quiet and the house settles, I find myself holding my breath, listening for that wet, sliding sound against the floorboards, wondering if someone else has found the space I left behind.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.